In 1960, critically acclaimed director Ingmar Bergman made a film called The Virgin Spring. The film received positive reviews across the board, it wowed critics, and it even won him his first Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film. Bergman made stunningly beautiful, thought-provoking, highbrow works of art, ones that were layered with subtext and big existential themes. Maybe this is why, to this day, critics and historians often overlook the fact that The Virgin Spring is in fact a horror film. Much like Bergman's other movies, including the critically acclaimed masterpiece The Seventh Seal from a couple of years earlier, The Virgin Spring explores the dark side of humanity. It depicts a godless world where evil exists within all of us. As well as that, The Virgin Spring is an early example of what we now might call a rape revenge movie. One that became the direct inspiration for one of the most infamous, brutal and reviled exploitation movies of all time, Wes Craven's Last House on the Left. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of folk horror, and we explore the dark, barren, godless world of Ingmar Bergman. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres across a number of weeks. We are currently in the midst of exploring the evolution of folk horror, and this is part 6, in which, as the intro suggested, we're going to be exploring Nordic folk horror and reviewing Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal and The Virgin Spring. Now, this is your spoiler warning. We will be discussing both these movies in depth, in spoilerific detail. If you haven't seen these movies, well, you've got to, really. I mean, you can't call yourself a cinephile without having seen some of the most iconic and influential Ingmar Bergman movies. So go away and watch them and come back. I promise you will not be disappointed. So, before I introduce my guest, here are a few contact details. You can email us. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter @evolutionpod or on Facebook. That's facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. And don't forget, you can also follow us on Letterboxd, and that's where you can keep up to date with what movies we're going to be covering in detail this series. That's letterboxd.com/evolutionpod. But let's get started. Joining me to discuss all things Ingmar Bergman. Well, how best to describe him? He's a journalist, he's a movie critic, he's a podcaster, he hosts the Arrow Video podcast, and he is now also a bona fide horror filmmaker. He's been on the podcast once before discussing the brilliant Candyman with me, and he's back. It is my great pleasure to welcome back Sam Ashurst. Sam, hello.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Well, yeah, very good on this, like, what feels like one of the hottest days ever
in
London.
It's we can see out of my window that the light is astonishing outside.
It really
I kind of
is.
wish we were making a film instead of a podcast, but you know.
Exactly. I know. Too much time spent indoors for people like us in our jobs as well, isn't there? That's the thing.
Exactly.
So tell me, first of all, I just want to start with some exciting news, because obviously recently it was the Frightfest lineup was announced.
Yes.
And Frankenstein's Creature is going to be playing in the Discovery screen.
It is indeed.
Very cool. As I think we briefly mentioned last time you were on the podcast, we talked a little bit about it.
Yeah.
And I said then, wouldn't it be amazing if it got to be on one of those screens?
Like, you predicted the Discovery screen as well, which is quite amazing.
Knew it.
It's on August the 27th on the Monday at 3:45 p.m. And so it's the closing film in the Cineworld Discovery screen. So
amazing.
It's very exciting.
So cool. So I think last time we spoke, you were sort of maybe just finishing it at that point. You were maybe in the sort of edit stage and everything.
That's right. Yeah.
How have you found it since? I mean, obviously, I know that it's been shown to a couple of people. Anton has written a review of it. Kim's written a review. It's all been really positive so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've seen it.
And I've seen it. And I absolutely love it. Yeah, absolutely loved it.
Thank you, man.
Really blown away by it. Do you know, it's really, I mean, it is, you know, I think because Paul McAvoy's mentioned it on this podcast as well when he was talking about the lineup, and he said, you know, it is quite an art house movie,
Absolutely.
I suppose. That's the thing.
Yeah,
and actually, you said that last time you were here as well.
Yeah.
But it's what I loved about it was that, you know, there is first of all that sort of temptation to call it theatrical, I suppose, because it is a sort of theatre style performance.
Yeah,
I suppose.
we've had that in a couple of the reviews.
Yeah. But I think you did an amazing job of making it look so beautiful and cinematic and atmospheric as well. Honestly, it really creeped me out actually watching it at night on my own on this big screen as well.
Fantastic. Like, honestly, that makes me so happy. Like, you know, there's so many influences on the film, and you know, I really do. I'm very kind of proud of how we've sort of. The intention was to really keep the spirit of James's play, and to make it feel like the play, obviously, but to really put on those cinematic elements to kind of bring out another dimension of the play, if that makes sense. And so I'm really happy that you've reacted in that way, because a couple of reviews, lovely reviews, and I very much appreciate them, but they both kind of said, you know, he's filmed the play as opposed to making a movie. But I don't. It's not that at all.
It's not that at all. Yeah. It reminded me of kind of old cinema in a way, I suppose. That's the thing that I got from it, like kind of that sort of German expressionism type stuff. You know,
this is exactly it, Mike. That's exactly it. Like James loves those movies, and so do I. You know, like Fritz Lang's one of my favourite directors of all time.
Yeah.
And like as a kind of, you know, almost have a kind of little bit of fun. I kind of thought to myself, well, you know, this is my first film.
Yeah.
So why not make it in the style of the first ever films, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Nice. I like it.
And because, you know, we were working with a low budget, I thought that, you know, we could have some cool effects and cool moments using that style that wouldn't necessarily break the bank.
Yes.
So, yeah, and I kind of basically wanted to make a film that was a reflection of my taste. So, you know, a film that felt like the sort of movies that I enjoy watching. Yeah. As opposed to sort of going down the traditional sort of low budget first UK film route.
You should probably say as well, for people that, you know, may not know anything about this film, I mean, tell us a little bit about it. So it's not your average kind of Frankenstein adaptation, is it?
No, exactly. So the film's called Frankenstein's Creature, and it's written by and starring an astonishing actor named James Swanton.
Yeah, absolutely incredible.
Who's kind of unreal. And we shot it on the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's novel being published.
Nice.
And it's basically that book, but from the perspective of the monster. Mm-hmm. And it is 90 minutes, but it is uncut. So it's a one-man film where James basically... it's just like making it was like watching a magic trick.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the way like the mood and the tone shifts just through his kind of physicality and his voice alone. And then, of course, we use kind of dissolves to sort of keep it visually interesting and, you know, make it feel as close to a kind of traditional film as we can, while still having that sort of uncut element, which is really important to the tone and you know, kind of some of the themes of the film as well. So
definitely,
it is unique.
It is absolutely.
So when you asked me to do this specific podcast,
yes,
I kind of said it would be a perfect forum to kind of talk a little bit about Frankenstein's Creature.
Yeah.
Can you see what I meant by that now?
What, in terms of linking to Ingmar Bergman?
Yes.
Only in that some of the story in the story he was telling had sort of folky rural elements to it, but I couldn't see an exact Bergman.
So okay, right. So from my perspective, so Frankenstein's Creature sort of deals with, and actually we're going to get into this because I think a lot of this is down to my interpretation of the film.
Yeah. Go on.
And kind of, you know, how I feel about both of them, but. For me, Frankenstein's Creature sort of talks about existential philosophy, like it discusses the absence of God.
Right,
Like ugly violence is juxtaposed with the beauty of nature.
Yes, okay, gotcha.
And obviously Bergman came from kind of a theatre background and he carried on directing plays when he was making films, and The Seventh Seal is actually an adaptation of a play. And sort of one of the most frequent criticisms against him, actually, because as much as he has this sort of towering reputation,
yes,
especially in this country, in Sweden they didn't appreciate him as much.
Let's
say that. And one of the most frequent criticisms was that his films were too theatrical. But there was loads of reasons they didn't like him. But
that's so interesting. I've never really thought that about the films of his that I've seen, at least. That's
no, same. But then kind of like, I guess, something like Persona could very easily be done as a play.
Yes, true.
But then you'd remove so many beautiful cinematic elements. Very, very, important to it. And I think that James could be, if he wanted to, a Max von Sydow type character if he wanted.
That's very true.
And it's got some pretty shots of horses in it.
That's very true. That is very true.
But yeah.
Interesting. I just thought maybe it was just the fact that it was a bit of an art house connection.
Yeah, no, you did. Yeah. And actually, it's not that like. I should say that Frankenstein's creature isn't necessarily influenced by Bergman. It's more directly influenced by Tarkovsky. And I sort of sent my second unit director, who shot lots of the natural stuff in Iceland. I sent him a lot of clips from Andrei Rublev and basically said, I want this, and this.
Yes.
I'm a little bit obsessed with Tarkovsky.
Right.
But then Tarkovsky was obsessed with Bergman, and he actually had 3 Bergman films in his top 10 of all time, which is kind of impressive.
Yeah.
So there is a connection there.
Interesting. So do you see Frankenstein's creature as a horror film?
Oh, 100%. 100%. Like I was very, very careful to, there are elements that I added that to pull out the horror.
Yeah.
We've got a jump scare, which, I love jump scares. Doing that in a theatre setting isn't,
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's true. And there's one, I don't want to give anything away, but there's one moment in it, and I have a real thing about like kind of, I get this a lot in movies like The Shining, like characters kind of stood quite far back in the frame, quite small in the frame, sort of just staring back at me almost in the distance. It's like that shot in The Innocents where the ghost woman is across the lake. All those types of shots really freak me out. And there's a moment in the middle of your film where it really sent a kind of shiver down my spine, where everything just kind of slows down for a minute. And it was wonderful. Yeah,
honestly,
really
I cannot tell you how happy that makes me to hear that. Honestly, and there's no influences on it. There's a shot that's sort of a reference to The Exorcist. There's Testament of Dr. Mabuse, which kind of has a horror feel. Island of Lost Souls, the 1932 version.
Yes.
Ringu, there's a bit in there as well. Eraserhead, which is a horror film for me. So yeah, there's loads of horror stuff in there.
Definitely.
I love horror. So,
wonderful. So just again, for anyone who is interested in seeing it at Frightfest, when will they be able to catch it?
So yeah, that is on August 27th. It's on the Monday, and it's at 3:45 p.m. and it's the closing film in the Cineworld Discovery screen. I can't believe it's at Cineworld on Leicester Square. That is just insane.
It's incredible. Are you going to sit? I mean, obviously you are, I suppose, but are you going to sit and watch it with the audience?
Yeah, I really want to. I hope I'm able to. But then I also, I've been sort of trying to I almost don't want to be able to, because I don't want to take the seat of someone who will be seeing it for the first time.
Yeah. I always wonder what that must be like for filmmakers, like having to sit there and re-watch it all with knowing that you've got however many hundreds of people also watching it at that same time,
I have to say, to be completely honest, and I've said this a couple of times, sort of tongue-in-cheek on other things, that it's arguably the greatest film ever made. For me it is, because it's my exact taste.
It's exactly what you want on screen.
So I honestly, I've seen it so many times now, and I could watch it again right now. I would love to sit with an audience, but I'm also kind of hoping it'll be sold out, so I won't be able to.
Yeah, exactly. Amazing. Oh, well, I can't wait. So, as we mentioned, we are going to be talking about Bergman this week predominantly. First of all, I just want to ask you a little bit about your thoughts on folk horror as a subgenre.
Yes.
It's quite a weird one. Everyone that I've spoken to so far kind of has their own takes on what is or isn't folk horror, that kind of thing. How would you define folk horror, do you think?
I've got a little sort of thing written down, but to be honest, it's basically what you've said on the show already.
Yeah.
Because it's such I'm almost learning from this podcast, to be completely honest.
Well, that's kind of how I feel. I'm learning as I go, week by week.
Because folk horror specifically is, like you say, such a hard thing to define. And actually, I got into a very, very minor and very, very pleasant text message argument with the co-host of the Arrow Video podcast, Dan Martin, earlier. We were trying to... I was basically suggesting a film was folk horror, and he was disagreeing. But what you've sort of said before, the rural settings, sort of the historical element, insular communities cut off from society with an outsider coming into that community, the belief system, sort of playing around with that, and sort of supernatural, violent happenings. I mean, you've said it all before.
Right. Yeah,
but
it's
that
interesting.
Works for me.
Well, that's great. Yeah, it's interesting because even when I had Jen Handorf joining me to talk Witchfinder General, even when we were talking about that film together, she was still not convinced that is even a folk horror because it's got so many just kind of historical drama elements, I suppose.
And Dan, who is married to Jen, also doesn't think it's a it's just a hard one, isn't it?
It is a hard one.
I'm enjoying the podcast. And
great. I'm so glad. Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think that adds to the fun of it, that, you can have a bit of fun and play a bit fast and loose with the term, to be honest, which I plan on doing. Yeah. And I think, especially this week, Bergman... a lot of people wouldn't even argue these are horror, let alone folk horror. That's the thing.
That drives me crazy.
Yes, me too.
Like I'll try not to get too much on my soapbox about this, but
please do. I love it.
But no, it drives me crazy. I feel like Bergman is like one of the all-time great horror directors. Yeah, and because so many of his films feel like horror for me. Yeah. People treat Hour of the Wolf as if it's like an anomaly, like it's his only horror film. And it's slightly weird that he did one, but like they're all pretty much all horror films, especially the two we're talking about today. I mean, for goodness sake.
Absolutely, yeah. It is crazy, actually. There's this kind of sort of darkness and dread through all of his films, isn't there? There's
completely.
This, palpable dread. Yeah.
Absolutely, and, The Seventh Seal is a film in which, death shows up, and it is essentially... Our lead is sort of being faced with all of the horrors of existence.
Yes, exactly.
Before ultimately, spoiler alert.
yes, fine.
Dying.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we'll go into it in more detail, but these films are definitely horror.
Yeah, no, I love it. And do you think they fit folk horror?
Yeah, there's a scene in The Seventh Seal where... the knight is confronted with a witch who's sort of tied to a stake, who's kind of about to be burned, and the monks who have imprisoned her, I'm talking about like the first appearance, they're spreading the guts of a black dog, because the smell sort of gets rid of the devil. As the knight walks away from the scene, the witch, who's kind of been silent up until that point, kind of suddenly rouses and lets out the most chilling scream. And it's like, A, that's horror, and B, that's 100% folk horror.
It is.
When you look at sort of the Witchfinder General, and that could be a scene from that film, basically.
Exactly.
Because you really feel from the performances that she's not a witch in that moment. And that... she's basically being subjugated. They're using this sort of plague and the religious attitudes to kind of as an excuse for cruelty, basically. There's a lot of that dotted throughout.
I think so. And I think that's what I find quite scary about folk horror, and that's why I would classify Witchfinder General as well as folk horror, because I don't think it's always so much the supernatural demonic entity that you're supposed to be scared of in folk horror. It's people and people's beliefs and the absolute diehard conviction of their beliefs that they will burn you in a big wicker effigy, or they will, do this or do that, regardless. There's no escape, kind of thing.
That's 100% it. And actually, that's kind of a major theme in Bergman's cinema, like in general. The idea that we are in a godless universe.
Yes.
The world is basically hell because of people. And
folk horror oozes that kind of nihilism, definitely,
completely.
I think.
And there is these films sort of, one of the reasons they're so scary is even when there's a supernatural element to them, what you've really got to fear is people that we could encounter.
Yeah.
Like we turn the wrong corner and we go into the wrong village.
Yeah.
And we're fucked.
You are fucked. Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
So, it's really interesting that you've brought Bergman into this, but he completely fits.
It does. The more you think about it, the more it does fit, which is what's really interesting about him. First of all, just to rewind slightly, Bergman, again, not always necessarily linked, instantaneously with horror. There might be a lot of people that don't know much about Bergman or haven't seen any Bergman films. Yeah. I know a lot of people that are like, oh, Bergman, isn't he just like a kind of art house director, and I haven't, or almost been a bit too maybe intimidated by the idea of watching a Bergman movie in a weird way. Do you know what I mean? I mean, first of all, how would you describe Bergman as a director? How would you describe his movies?
Well, so Bergman, for people who know absolutely nothing about him, he was basically like a superstar director. He was kind of like a Hitchcock or a Tarantino. Yeah. Like when the Virgin Spring came out, he was on the cover of Time magazine.
That's amazing.
And I don't know, have you ever seen that cover?
No, right, I didn't know that.
I'm going to pull it up now. Yes. I know this doesn't make great podcasts, but if you're at home listening,
I'm going to tweet it.
Yeah, great. I mean, that is.
I love it. Look at him. He's looking through his lens there.
He's looking through his lens, and in the background, you have got a horror scene.
Yeah, and actually a folk horror scene as well.
Exactly.
100%. Yeah. You've got some woods. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah,
love
and your distant figure there, which I'm sure
exactly.
is sending chills.
Exactly.
And, the woman hiding behind the tree, and so that is something from a horror movie. So he was on the cover of Time, and basically his name is kind of a shorthand term for a certain kind of art house cinema.
Yes.
He was focused on sort of big themes: love, death, the absence of God, the cruelty of man, the stuff that we've kind of talked about. Religion and the pursuit of meaning is just a huge continuing theme in his work. His dad was a Lutheran priest, and they did not get on.
Yes.
His dad, he's described his dad as a pedant, and I think there's probably other words that he could probably use to describe him. They really didn't get on, but he was very close to his mum, and you can kind of see that dynamic playing out in his movies, but especially in the ones that we're discussing today. They're very interesting if you kind of know that about his dad. And like we said earlier, he wasn't a critical darling in Sweden.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it wasn't just the fact that they felt his films were quite theatrical. It was they didn't like the sort of cultural representation of Swedish people as being quite, they felt as being quite dour.
Yes.
But I actually think that his films have quite a strong sense of humour as well.
Like they do.
It's a dark, dry sense of humour, but
definitely.
But it's there.
The Seventh Seal definitely does.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And just sort of one thing I'd like to sort of mention is that in 1960, which is the same year he appeared on the cover of Time, the Swedish Film Institute published an anti-Bergman issue. This is, how bad it was.
Right.
But one of the harshest essays in that magazine was by Bergman himself, who published it under a pseudonym, Ernest Riffy, which was the name of his wife's hairdresser at that time. And I genuinely think that's one of the most telling events in Bergman's life, because it's both kind of self-indulgent and self-critical, which, is quite important for his movies, quite dark, but also very funny. And so, a lot of his films do feel like, they're saying that life's a joke with kind of the darkest possible punchline.
Definitely.
So I thought that was quite interesting.
That is really interesting. That's really funny. And I do find it really interesting that I didn't know that he was a really sort of renowned theatre director as well, actually, because I always think of his films as really inherently cinematic in a way, the polar opposite to what you'd consider theatrical, I suppose, which is really interesting.
Yeah, no, he basically, like, his work ethic was kind of insane. He directed a movie a year and 2 plays a year.
Yeah.
So, and it was very seasonal, like,
Yes. Yes.
So, I do see that not just in, I think a lot of his films could be done as plays, and he adapted a lot of his own plays for film. But it's also there in the way he worked with actors.
Yes.
Yeah, so he basically had a troupe.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll go on to this a bit later on, but he just worked with the same people. And so it was kind of like Fassbinder.
Yeah.
In that they both kind of had their players that they would just take from film to film. And I think it's that relationship, that continuing relationship, that helps make his film so special.
All right, well, let's get into it. So we're going to talk, first of all, we'll go in chronological order. So let's start with The Seventh Seal,
yes,
which we've already briefly mentioned, from 1957. Sam, do you mind doing a little plot rundown of The Seventh Seal?
Right, so I can. I definitely can.
Oh, God. Thank God you can.
Yeah. Well, we're going to say what, we're going to say what the story's about, and then I think we're going to say what it's actually about.
Yes,
and
exactly.
That's going to be quite a lot longer than the plot.
Yeah.
Because it's ostensibly about a knight in 14th century Sweden named Antonius Block, who's on a journey to the afterlife. There's a possibility that he's dead when we first see him.
Yes.
But that's kind of a little bit, it's vague. But basically, he kind of wakes up on a beach, he's greeted by death, and makes a bargain to play a game of chess with him to kind of prolong his life a bit longer for the kind of length of the game, so that he and his squire can sort of travel around a bit and meet people. But we kind of discover at the end that the reason he's tried to extend his life is so that he can reunite with the love he left behind to take part in the Crusades. So and it's also about the fact that horrible shit happens and God doesn't really do anything about it. But we'll get into that.
Yeah, definitely. It is like we said. There's a big element of his movies. In fact, I think it's what his movies are known for, isn't it? Is these characters having these existential crisis.
100%.
This kind of feeling of absolute sort of godless worlds that these characters live in as well, isn't it? And
exactly.
The Seventh Seal is probably one of his most iconic movies, and it feels like it is the embodiment of that kind of theme, isn't it?
Yeah. 100%. And I also think that it's kind of a bit deeper than that. I think that Seventh Seal is actually about Ingmar Bergman and his art and his career.
Oh, interesting.
There's so much in it that I feel is basically him having a direct conversation with his audience.
Right.
So there's a scene where there's an artist who's painting the Dance of Death.
Yes.
And you could kind of see that as Bergman himself, who's painting the Dance of Death with the Seventh Seal. And there's loads of moments where I feel like he's telling the audience why he made this film. Partly because it's kind of psychologically healthy to be frightened, partly to engage his audience with the ideas he's expressing. So there's that line, a painted skull is more interesting than a naked wench, or something.
Yes.
Like that. Yeah. And so that's saying, look, I've personified death to give you this message.
Yes.
Right, and we'll get into what the message is. But he also sort of, it's to remind everyone watching that they're going to die, which isn't, the most cheeriest thing in the world, but
yes.
It is quite important to him, I think. And he kind of says, that's so that they'll think and be more frightened.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of getting his audience to really think about death so that they can properly live. I feel that that's in there. But the film's message is that there is no God, and he's using the medium of a horror film to express that idea. Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And the film opens with, again, one of probably the most iconic moments in one of the most iconic films of his career, which is
literally everyone can see that image.
Everyone knows it. I'm sure even if you haven't seen the film, you'd know that image where Max von Sydow's character plays chess with death. And it is a really interesting, it's a striking kind of image to start the movie with as well, isn't it?
I mean for me, I love that image, obviously. It's wonderful. And there's an interview with Bergman where he talks about the interviewer asks him, why did you dress death as a monk? and Bergman says, "Or it could be a clown," which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, in that sequence, the image that I love the most is those two black horses in the sea.
Yeah.
I just think it's one of my favourite sort of moments from any film ever.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, the chess playing is, it's beautifully composed.
It feels like it's this kind of very stark, obvious contrast of black and white, and chess and chessboards and chess pieces have that feel, don't
Definitely,
they?
yeah.
And his films are very kind of stark black and white. We talked a couple of weeks back actually about Night of the Hunter, and again, it has that kind of, it almost feels like it's mocking the idea of good and evil and Christianity and God and the devil with Night of the Hunter.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a bit of that in this as well, that it is kind of, in a way, mocking that idea of just good versus bad, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that kind of that mockery is kind of throughout. There's a scene where it's the bit with the theatrical troupe where they're doing that kind of bawdy song about death.
Yes,
and they're actually kind of talking about death on the beach, and like it's very silly and ridiculous, and you sort of compare that to that opening sequence, which is very serious and very quite grim and all the rest of it. And it's almost like he's kind of sending himself up within the same film, and it's kind of, that song is intercut with a scene where an actor is being seduced by the blacksmith's wife. They go into the bushes, and then we kind of go back to the song. But then the seriousness comes back in because, and it's an amazing moment. It's one of my favourite moments in the film because, you've got this quite jolly, quite, pleasant song. And then the monks arrive.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Their song kicks in.
And that overwhelms. Is terrifying music that comes in.
It's terrifying music, and it's almost kind of Spielbergian because we see the looks on the troops' faces first, and we hear that music, and it almost feels like it's higher in the mix, like it's really enveloping them, and then they kind of come in, and it's a scary scene. And it's a really interesting juxtaposition because kind of that sequence is connecting sex, religion, and entertainment as things that kind of remind us of, but also distract us from death, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah.
And then, the monks come in, and behind them are the screaming plague victims, and they're being whipped as they walk, and, death suddenly becomes a very real thing that's kind of hard to ignore. I feel like there's a sort of element of the cruelty of religion, or what Bergman saw as the cruelty of religion, that
definitely,
it's a distraction. It's a way of kind of processing death, and understanding death, but also it's become a path to death.
Yes. Yes, it's basically all about, especially Christianity in a way. I mean, it is about death, isn't it? The symbol of Christianity is death,
and oh my God, the amount of times Christ on the cross appears, not just in The Seventh Seal, but in so many of Bergman's movies.
Yes.
It's such a recurring, and it feels like he uses the same prop each time.
Definitely.
And so that's a good point. That's
and again,
really
a hugely kind of definitely a running folk horror thing as well. And maybe with the Blood on Satan's Claw in a way feels like the biggest exception to a lot of these rules, because that feels a bit more good versus evil. But a lot of these others, The Wicker Man and Witchfinder General, and even a couple of the others that we spoke about that are kind of on the fringes of folk horror, like Oni Barbar and Night of the Hunter, they all do feel a bit like they are mocking religion, or saying actually it's the people, Christians are more dangerous than anything else that we can dream up.
Completely. And these films often use they use kind of different religions, like made up religions, in order to kind of make the critique. But there is that wonderful moment in The Wicker Man, which I think you did highlight in your podcast, the line about how ridiculous Christianity is when you kind of look at the mythology.
When he says the son of a virgin, himself something by God, or by a ghost. That's it. Yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah, so it is definitely a running theme in folk horror, for sure.
It's really interesting.
And it's kind of interesting that that Bergman chose to personify death and not God. Because he could have done that. He could have made the same points. And actually the Night block, which is an interesting name, but he's looking for God. He wants to sort of talk to God at certain points in the film. But all he's got to talk to is death. And that's really interesting in terms of Bergman's sort of themes about the absence of God and all
definitely
the rest of it.
Definitely,
because death is there. We know that's waiting for us. So
absolutely,
it's interesting that is actually personified and not something he doesn't believe exists.
And it is weird, like you say, that there is this element of there's this kind of light versus dark, obviously, element to this, and the way that the tone shifts, it does go from kind of sometimes quite comedic or comical or verging on slapstick or something,
definitely,
into this kind of dark existential dread as well. He manages that quite well, because again, folk horror seems to be, look at The Wicker Man, it's that weird kind of tonal balance of you don't quite know where you sit with a lot of these films as well, which is really interesting.
100%. And there's a couple of moments like that I'd like to discuss, because they also kind of fit into my theory about how Bergman is talking directly to his audience with this film.
Yeah, well, go on, let's get into it. Yeah.
So there's a moment where the squire is talking about singing a song.
Yes.
And Block kind of clears his throat to basically stop him from doing it.
Yeah.
And he says, some people don't appreciate my art, and I don't wish to torment anyone, which, in the context of this specific film, feels like a meta joke, basically.
Yes.
He's saying, he's talking to those critics, who don't appreciate him, and it's a tongue-in-cheek, I don't want to torment anyone, having made arguably the most sort of bleakest
yes, exactly.
film ever.
Yeah.
And there's another moment where, again, it's the squire, and he's talking to the blacksmith, and he says, if all is imperfect in this imperfect world, then love is the most imperfect in its perfect imperfection.
Oh my God, yeah.
And the blacksmith replies, you're lucky to have such a fluid tongue that you believe your own twaddle. And the squire replies, believe? Who said I did? But I love giving good advice. Now that feels very much like dialogue from a writer who would go on to publish a self-critical article under a pseudonym.
It does. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, he's basically saying, I can say this stuff, but I don't necessarily believe it. But, I'm kind of putting it out there for you to kind of make your own mind up.
Yes.
There's just so much tongue-in-cheek stuff in this film, I think.
Do you think that so was Bergman as a man, was he very anti-religion, anti-Christian? Was he, in his life? Do you know?
Yeah. So he basically was raised in that environment and spent kind of a great deal of time breaking free of that structure.
Yeah.
And so I think there was quite a lot of resentment there.
Yes.
And what's kind of unbelievable is that the Vatican really liked the Seventh Seal. Like they gave it their approval.
Well, it just shows how genius the film is on so many levels,
exactly,
isn't it?
Yeah.
It is. I mean, that's the thing I was going to ask you, actually. I mean, if you strip away all of the stuff that we're talking about right now about this film, and obviously this is the sort of film that a lot of critics, academics love to talk about. It's hailed as a classic with so many so many critics, I suppose. Just on very sort of base primary level, dramatically, do you think the film is still works? Just as a drama that it is.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Taking out all the sort of analysis and interpretation, like even just as an enjoyable film that sets up a premise and then kind of plays around with that premise and then delivers a conclusion that's been foreshadowed throughout.
Yes.
It works.
It does.
And it's, for me, it's very entertaining.
Yeah.
If people like stuff like The Witch, or, it's no more difficult or, it's entertaining, it's funny, it's scary, it's fascinating. So sort of analysis aside, it's just a very good film.
Yeah, it's
and
still
technically as well.
It's incredible.
Coming from the perspective, of a director, some of the choices in there in terms of how he uses shots to illustrate what's going on in the scene, or the themes of the film. There's some beautiful shots in there. I've gone back into analysis, haven't I? But
that's no. But you're right. I mean, it is technically beautiful. I think that's the thing I find with all of his films. Actually, is that they're kind of hypnotic. I could just happily just watch them and let them wash over me in a way.
Completely.
They're always stunning to look at. And what about Max von Sydow then? I mean, he starred in I think 11 of Bergman's films, so they're well known for this kind of collaboration.
Yeah.
What do you think of him in this film, and what do you think of him in general, and why does he fit Bergman's films so well, do you think?
So what I kind of love about him is, he's got such a special presence.
Yes.
Like, both in terms of his kind of physicality, he kind of looks like he's been carved out of a tree or like carved out of rock or something, He's got such a powerful presence. And then there's his voice, which is, even more powerful. And in terms of what we were talking about before, he made his debut for Bergman in a play, actually. In what was it, Peer Gynt. And so I really think it's that kind of theatrical quality that made him a good fit for Bergman. And actually, that idea of working with the troupe and working with the same people over and over again, whether it's people in front of the camera or behind the camera, Bergman talked about that in an interview, and it's sort of one of the best answers I've seen to a question, where basically he was asked, why do you work with these people over and over again? And he said that, sometimes something magical happens in front of the camera, right? Doesn't happen all the time, but it happens sometimes. And if you work with the same people over and over, your relationship develops and you all have a certain level of confidence that means that something magical is more likely to happen in front of the camera. And he says when it does, there's nothing like it, and it's like a third dimension opens up in front of you. And I'd have to say I had that on Frankenstein's Creature with James, where I literally felt I was watching a magic trick. And so to hear sort of Bergman talk about that very specific, very sort of intense feeling where it's almost like time slows down, and everyone's so focused on this one thing, and so I imagine that if you can kind of engineer that by working with the same people over and over again, it would be quite addictive.
Definitely.
So I'm not surprised that he just kept on working with von Sydow, aside from the fact that he is an astonishing actor, and why wouldn't you?
He is astonishing, isn't he? He's got a lot going on behind his eyes at all times, I think. Again, it adds to that kind of internal crisis that probably a lot of the characters he plays in Bergman films have.
Completely.
It's all going on. He doesn't have to say anything a lot of the time with Max von Sydow.
That's really interesting because Bergman himself, like, he's kind of from a distance quite an imposing figure, kind of like von Sydow, but you only have to watch one or two of his films to see the internal anguish that's in those eyes. So that's also interesting that maybe he represents that side of it, the outward strength but the sort of inner chaos.
That's it, isn't it? As often they use their kind of leading actors, these filmmakers, as the kind of conduits to themselves, 100%. Almost, aren't they? It's really interesting. I wonder what he was like. Again, I picture, for some reason when I watch his films, I picture he must have been quite a hard going director, almost like in a kind of Kubrick-y way, but I have no evidence to back that up, but I feel like he must have been quite a perfectionist.
I'm sure, but unlike Kubrick, I think Kubrick got the best from his actors in a very different way to Bergman. I think Bergman, and he had a lot of relationships off camera with his actors, and I think that's because he worked, or partly because he worked so closely and I think emotionally with them. Like, he brought out incredible performances from people. He's especially good at working with women, and he wrote and directed some amazing roles for women. And so I think different to Kubrick, but I think that sense of perfection is there, and also apparently he was very unforgiving when people were late. He said that he got that from his dad. He said that when he was younger, he was a dreamer and quite lazy, but his dad was very sort of exacting and very punctual, so he kind of learned that from his dad.
Yes, didn't suffer fools, I imagine.
So yeah, I think he's this interesting combination of imaginative sort of dreamer, this very creative soul, who would when he was a young boy look at a painting and see it moving and hear music coming from it, and I kind of love that that story, and so he was a dreamer when he was young, but he was given that sort of the hard side that directors really need, because it's not, especially for a director, Kubrick was an extreme, but as a director, you do actually have to push people. You do have to be hard, and actors kind of want that from you as well.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Because everyone wants to be pushed to their limits.
Yeah. He has that human side, I think that's the thing, doesn't he? Actually, his films, despite the fact that they are filled with kind of godless existential dread, they still have a kind of warmth to them in a weird way, don't they?
100%. Yeah. And this is one of the things that makes him so unique, because, you can see from watching these films, like, how carefully composed they are, and how he's clearly a very technical director, which can sometimes make someone a cold director, but like you say, there's so much soul, ironically.
Yes.
There is so much soul in these films, which is a very, very, special combination that I'm sure is part of why,
why he's thought of as the master.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Brilliant. Any other kind of key moments for you that we haven't mentioned, or anything else you want to mention about Seventh Seal?
A couple of kind of horror-y moments.
Oh, yeah, go on.
So a really sort of key scene where basically there's an actor and his wife, and they've got a baby boy, and the night spent some time with them, and the scenes kind of feels like a real celebration of life. It's kind of the happiest moment in the film, potentially. And they're kind of sharing strawberries with the night, and they're smelling the fruit and eating it, and it's a sunny day and all the rest of it. But there's a detail in that scene that I haven't really seen talked about anywhere. I'm sure there's some essay somewhere, but in the shot, in the background of that scene, the actor's skull mask, who kind of played around earlier in the film, it's on a pole in the back of the shot, and the wind is making it shake its head no.
Oh my God, amazing.
So almost like it's kind of rejecting the moment. It's kind of like passing judgment on the happy scene.
Yes.
And then death sort of reappears, and they play a bit more chess, and Death actually mentions the family and the baby boy specifically
in a very kind of foreboding way.
It's like he's threatening the child, but it doesn't pay off.
No,
at any point in the film, and so it feels to me like those things are connected. It's almost like Bergman is saying, not even children are safe from death.
Yeah,
he will come and collect what he comes to collect, and so a lot of people have interpreted that scene as Bergman's message is that family is the way people should live. Keep things simple, family focused, enjoy nature and the seasons. But yeah, I just see that mask shaking its head in the background.
So interesting. Yeah, that's so right. And it's like, enjoy this while it lasts kind of thing. Yeah,
exactly.
That weird kind of mix of positive and negative, like you talked about at the beginning as well, of sort of saying, yes, all of these things are distractions from death, but don't forget it's there.
Exactly, 100% that. And then just one other sort of kind of my favourite horror moment in the film. It's the bit where he sort of goes to talk to the witch and basically wants to meet the devil, so he can ask him about God. And the knight and the witch are connected in really interesting ways. The witch is kind of in a wagon, and we see her as if she's behind bars.
Yes.
But the first time we see a reverse shot is where the priest basically says that he wants to ask the devil about God.
Yeah.
And then he's behind the bars. And it kind of connects to an earlier scene where he was sort of in a confession booth, and it's death inside, and he doesn't realise it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, he's asking for knowledge about God,
Mm-hmm.
and he's behind bars. So it's like he's trapped by his lack of knowledge.
Mm.
But then there's an amazing moment in that scene, the horror moment, where she sort of asks if the devil is standing behind him.
Yes.
And he kind of turns in terror, and as he does so, his head blocks the witch in the shot.
Yes.
And then she's kind of revealed again when he turns back and says the devil isn't there, and she says the devil is with her always. So that kind of means that when he turned, the devil was behind him, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah.
And it's kind of subtle, but I just think it's a really cool moment, and feels like a scene from like a cool like possession movie. Basically.
Yes, yeah.
Like it's a real cool small horror moment.
It is, one of those
Really
misdirection moments from a horror films. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, exactly that.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, that's it for the seventh seal.
I love it. No, it's great. It's great. It's really, really cool. And again, it's this weird something again we've talked about with a lot of these folk horrors. We talked about it a big way with Night of the Hunter actually, and actually we talked, because I tend to bring Lynch into these kind of conversations a lot. But,
of course,
this idea of movies like Blue Velvet as well, where you've got, happy idyllic life, but that there's something wrong, there's something off, there's something dark beneath the surface, that what you're seeing really isn't real. And it's like what you were saying there with the background with the sort of skull mask shaking its head, is as if to go, these white picket fences, this isn't real. This this isn't
true.
This isn't the idyllic kind of life that enjoy it while it lasts, but it's not all gonna, it's not always gonna be there kind of thing.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's so good.
And there's definitely a lot of that too. Yeah, Night of the Hunter with that kind of over the top fairy tale element to it, where it's obviously not quite, that kind of dreamlike nature to it. And again, Blood and Satan's got a lot of these they have these kind of almost happy fairy tale elements to them, but with this kind of underlying dread or menace.
And Lynch loved Bergman, obviously.
Exactly.
And you know, Mulholland Drive feels like a take on Persona.
Yes. Definitely.
And obviously he was an influence on loads of directors. Robert Altman, Fassbinder, Lars von Trier, to quite an enormous degree, I think. Kubrick loved him. Brian De Palma parodied The Seventh Seal in his student short Wotan's Wake, which I think was quite well reviewed by Pauline Kael, I seem to remember. But
do you know what I always think of as well? The end of The Seventh Seal reminds me of the end of Monty Python and the Meaning of Life, where death comes to the dinner party.
Who is it, darling? It's a Mr. Death or something. He's come about the reaping. I don't think we need any at the moment.
Hello. But don't leave him hanging around outside, darling. Ask him in.
Darling, I don't think it's quite the moment.
Do come in. Come along in. Come and have a drink. Do. Come on.
Before we move on, we should mention that final scene. Because that is an unbelievable horror moment.
It is
so good. It's, again, kind of like earlier with the troupe, where they heard the music and we see their reaction first. We see the reaction of the knight and and his wife and the squire and everyone around that table. They kind of turn and then we cut to that shot of him slightly at a distance, in shadow.
Yes.
And it's such a beautiful... I mean, that's German expressionism.
Absolutely. It is,
It's a stunning shot. And, very, very horror.
Yeah, it is.
Bergman was a horror director.
There you go. He was, absolutely. All right, let's move on to the next one then as well, because I think, again, so many horror connections with the next film we're about to talk about as well. God, so this is The Virgin Spring.
Yeah, this is much more stripped down than The Seventh Seal.
It is.
It's very direct, visually and narratively. Bergman didn't write it, and actually didn't rate it.
Interesting.
He wasn't a massive fan of it, and he doesn't. I'm pretty sure he doesn't even mention it in his biography, The Magic Lantern, which is kind of interesting, because I mean, it won him his first Oscar.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It's a turning point in his career, and he was obviously very grateful for that, because that completely changed his career.
Yeah.
But as a film itself, I think, it didn't have, and as we talk about it, there's not too much analysis. I mean, there's some.
No, you're right. And I wonder if that's what it is, because again, we'll get into this in a bit, but it feels like one of his more sort of unsung movies in his compared to Persona, Seventh Seal, some of these others.
Yeah. It's not as kind of explored.
People think of it as kind of B tier Bergman almost, don't they? It's really strange.
It's amazing.
It's
an amazing film.
Yeah.
Plot. So it's basically about a religious family who kind of spoil their daughter, and they spoil her, but they also want to protect her from corruption. They want to keep her innocent, so they kind of grant her every wish as long as she stays a child. But kind of in doing that, they create a naivety in the girl, and it makes her a target for three brothers who rape and murder her when she goes on a journey to church on behalf of the family. But then those rapists and murderers seek shelter in the girl's family home, and the patriarch has to decide what to do with them.
Yes.
That's pretty much
it.
It's
actually quite a simple. It is quite a simple little sort of. Almost feels like this kind of morality tale or cautionary tale or something, doesn't it? Like very kind of stripped back.
Yeah, well, it's based on a Swedish ballad from the 13th century. So it kind of has that folky kind of like fairy tale feel to it.
It definitely does, doesn't it? The whole kind of it's almost like send the princess out into the woods, and the kind of horrors that lurk within.
Exactly. Yeah,
really interesting. What were your? First of all, what do you think of this movie? Then you're a fan.
I am. I mean, the sort of the rape revenge subgenre is not something I'm a massive fan of.
No, it's got a lot to answer for in a way. This film.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah. And so. But this film's power is unreal. And I feel like its simplicity, there were infinitely nastier films that were inspired by this film.
Yes,
right?
Yes,
and nasty is sort of underlined,
yes.
Right? But this film isn't nasty, it's brutal.
Yes,
if that makes sense.
I think you're right. Yes.
Like it's not like it's set out to shock.
No,
in the same kind of way that those later films did.
Exactly.
And in those later films, it feels like almost like the people making it were having fun, right?
Totally.
Whereas this doesn't feel like it's designed for people to have fun and to whoop and cheer and all the rest of it. In the third act when people take their revenge, it's almost as if the revenge itself weighs as heavy as the act. I mean,
it's downplayed, it's not sensationalized or anything, is it?
It's not. And the way so there's three brothers, there's the two perpetrators, and then there's the kind of younger brother that kind of witnessed it, and you get a sense that he was disturbed by what he saw, but he's not able to kind of process that. And he's been raised in this environment where all of this is kind of sort of normal, but you get a sense that he knows it's wrong. And so you get pleasure when the two brothers die, but even there's like it's done in such a way where you're like, fucking hell. But then the little brother gets killed as well, and that is brutal.
It's disturbing. Exactly.
Disturbing. Exactly.
And again, it doesn't. Yes, you're right, and it takes away that element of like the good guys and the bad guys, and it just makes you go again, oh, what a horrible, fucked up, godless world, and how awful human beings are to human beings, basically, isn't
it?
Yeah.
And it's that sense that like everyone has got good and evil within them.
Yes.
Like that little boy had the potential to be good.
Yes.
Potentially.
Yes.
And the family were good before they were corrupted by this terrible thing. And so it's about that balance of good and evil within us all.
So interesting. I mean, it's so interesting. First of all, I think that this was this movie won him his first Oscar. Is that right? The Virgin Spring?
Yeah, the best foreign.
It's amazing, isn't it? Really, that a rape revenge movie, basically, which is what it is, won an Oscar. First of all, and this
is it. It wasn't the first example of that subgenre. There were a couple of others before. I think the earliest example is a film called Safe in Hell,
from
1931, which is basically about a prostitute on the run. but that speaks to the power of the film.
Yes, exactly that. Yes.
It doesn't feel cheap.
No.
In any way.
No.
You feel like you've been affected by it.
Yeah.
You know.
Definitely.
In a really sort of unique way.
There's some interesting stuff going on at the beginning, isn't there? I mean, what's going on with the other female character who we see kind of praying to this sort of is Odin or somebody?
Yeah, that's right. It's Odin.
So it's Norse gods.
So that for me is the element that most makes this folk horror.
Yes,
because it's that clash between the sort of the old pagan attitudes of the foster daughter, and the goat-herded brothers. You know, they're all sort of like this pagan subsection. And then you've got the burgeoning Christian religion of the central family, and it's the way those two things sort of interact that gives it this really quite intense horror vibe. And then you've got that creepy dude with the relics who kind of seems to confirm that Odin granted the foster daughter's wish. And that whole bit is really terrifying. And it
so it's like, is that all her doing? Did she wish for that to happen? Did she want that to happen?
This is it. Like, she did wish for it. She was jealous of this perfect daughter.
Yes, yeah.
She wasn't, she's the foster daughter, and she's not spoiled in the same way that the other girl is, and the other girl is sort of held in a higher regard. So there's a sense that, she wanted to bring her down to her level, but it kind of went out of hand.
Yeah.
And she's there to witness what happens and all the rest of it. I don't think that Bergman would say that she prayed to a god and the god granted the wish. That doesn't fit with what I think about him. So I kind of think it's all part of the same, godless, like, you may think that these spirits in the sky control existence, but in actuality it's the cruelty of man. And it's whether that person has decided to be good or evil that day, or whether or not
you're right,
their experience. So but what's kind of interesting about it is that it's such a savage combination of those two things, the sort of the Christian vengeance combined with the savagery of paganism. And all about the corruption of evil and the absence of God. It's all the same stuff.
It is, totally. And we should talk about the rape scene then, I suppose, and the way it's portrayed. I mean, again, we've talked about it weirdly. We've talked about this happening quite a lot in folk horrors so far. Witchfinder General has rape in it. The Blood on Satan's Claw has a really brutal, weird rape scene in the middle of it as well. And again, Jen was kind of arguing that both of those are kind of done very well. What's your opinion on the way that sort of the rape is portrayed in this movie?
Oh man, it's really hard. It's really hard to watch because you're there with her.
Yes,
like it's on her. The camera's on her face, and
yes, exactly. And I think that's
and you can see it. Like, what's going to happen. There's so much tension.
Yes, it's the build-up. It's the build-up, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. And then, it feels like it goes on for quite a long time, but it's actually relatively, quick. And then, but even like the way her body's left, it feels so real. Like,
yes, it does.
And it's sort of the beauty of the environment as well. And that ugly violence in that beautiful setting. It's this really weird juxtaposition that
totally
sort of adds to the horror of it.
It absolutely does. And the way that again the kind of the sort of fairy tale elements or the fantastical elements all kind of suddenly disappear at that moment, where it feels like you say, you're suddenly watching something that feels very real. And that's it. I think he knows when to just sort of sort of strip all that other stuff away, I suppose, at that moment. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then, you know, from that point on, the whole film just, you know, it's almost like the film itself has been corrupted by that scene.
Yeah, it flips. Yeah.
It feels like a different movie after that point, very much so.
It does.
And just, it's almost like constant tension from that point on, really.
It is the classic kind of, we know what the other characters don't, you know, when they go into that house and seek shelter, isn't it? And there is a real sense of suspense then throughout the rest of the movie.
It really is amazing.
It's wonderful. I mean, we should talk briefly as well, because we have mentioned it already in terms of its legacy, but this movie, you know, I'm sure most people know, but this was the inspiration for Wes Craven's Last House on the Left. I mean, Last House on the Left is essentially a remake, isn't it, really, of The Virgin Spring?
It 100% is.
Yeah.
Here's the first motion picture to offer to the daring a look into the final, maddening space between life and death. The Last House on the Left. To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie.
The exact same story of two girls, you know, raped and murdered, and then they find shelter in the house, the parents of one of the victims, don't they?
This is it. And Wes Craven, you know, is a director that I hugely admire.
Yeah.
And, you know, he is exactly the sort of person who would, you know, remake a Bergman movie.
He is.
I thought, well, what's a good plot? And I thought The Virgin Spring was such a remarkably concise and tight and ironic story. And I think, by the way, Bergman thought that because it was a centuries-old part of their folklore in his area of the world, that he borrowed it for his movie. So, I borrowed the basic story outline and the sort of reverse of, you know, the straight and narrow parents, very religious father, turning and becoming quite vicious and, you know, completely beyond the law and taking revenge.
And what's interesting about him, you know, in horror terms, is the fact that, you know, each decade he made a film that completely changed the horror landscape.
Almost encapsulates what we think of for that decade as well, you know?
It's completely. Yeah. And you know, that's what he did here. I have to say, you know, I'm not a huge fan of Last House on the Left. I've only seen it once.
Yeah. There's so much about it that is just so unbelievably jarring and uncomfortable, and not in a way that feels intended a lot of the time. I think that's the thing.
Exactly. I mean, it was made cheap and quickly. You know, it's classic exploitation movie style, and it just feels so much nastier in a different way to The Virgin Spring.
Yes, exactly.
Both in terms of the violence and the themes, but you know, it tapped into something that was in the zeitgeist. And,
definitely.
You know, it's really interesting that, you know, it's a Bergman movie or, you know, a remake of a Bergman movie that kind of reflected the 70s, you know.
I think that's right. I think, like, suddenly loads of horror filmmakers were channeling that nihilism that Bergman has always had by that point, but because of what was going on in America at this time, suddenly all of these movies, Rosemary's Baby and, you know, Last House on the Left, even Witchfinder General, The Wicker Man, they all have these very downbeat, you know, Night of the Living Dead, there is no happily ever after, it ends in a very kind of downbeat way. There's this feeling of there is no hope, there is no escape kind of thing. It feels like, you know, obviously Bergman had been doing that since the 50s, but it's that, you know, channeling that kind of same idea, isn't it?
Completely. And I think, you know, a lot of it, you know, certainly in the States, a lot of it is down to the Vietnam War, and all those images that, you know, insanely brutal, cruel, violent images that were on the news. And you know, there were stories of rape and murder that were coming out of that war as well.
And Wes Craven talked about seeing, like you say, seeing news footage of people being killed or mistreated or whatever, and it was just every day there again and again. It's that weird feeling of the everyday that, you know, within this violence that you see in some of these movies as well, which makes it
completely, and it kind of ties it all together because, you know, Bergman included footage of Vietnamese monks kind of burning themselves alive in persona.
Yes.
And it kind of really feels like that war is the epitome of what Bergman has been saying in his films all along. You know, whether it's the violent plague and the Seventh Seal being used as a reason to burn the witch, or you know, the opportunistic rape and murder in the Virgin Spring being used as a reason to carry on that murder. You know, the violence begetting violence sort of angle. It feels
it's
like,
always saying people are fucked, basically.
Yeah, exactly. You know, man has a great capacity for evil, and you know, God is irrelevant.
Yeah,
so
that's so true. It's so true.
Can I say one more thing about Virgin Spring?
Please.
Before we kind of wrap up. It's basically just that I think it's an amazing sequence.
No, go on, yeah.
So I feel like, you know, if the Seventh Seal was kind of a rebellion against his father's teachings, I feel that the Virgin Spring is against his father himself. The patriarch in the Virgin Spring is kind of a really interesting character.
Yes.
And the way Bergman shoots him is really interesting. The sequence at the end where the father is kind of begging God for understanding. And, you know, how could this happen? And, you know, he's kind of, he's where it happened in that sort of beautiful natural area. And another director in that moment might use a God's eye shot. So that's the name of a shot that's kind of high in the air, looking down on what's happening. And that shot can suggest like God is kind of wisely observing what's happening, or it can be used ironically to suggest he's kind of ignoring what's going on. But Bergman doesn't use it at all, because God is absent. And so, you know, von Sydow is framed in the distance. You know, he's low down, his back's to the camera, which is fascinating because, you know, this is a big emotional moment, and Bergman loved shooting faces. That's one of his biggest recurring things. So to choose not to do it here must mean something. And I think it's because he wants the character to be sort of as isolated as possible in this moment. I don't think Bergman feels any sympathy for this guy at that moment.
No, and actually, do you know what? I was going to say that about the whole way through. I don't think there's nothing really likable about that father character.
No.
From the very beginning, you don't really like him, do you? That's the thing. And so, in some ways, there is a tendency not to want to feel sympathy for him, even after everything that happens to his daughter. It's really weird.
Completely. And I feel like, you know, Bergman's kind of having his cake and eating it too by, you know, having the father say at the end, you know, I'm going to build a church here.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because to some people, that's a happy ending, or as happy an ending as we're going to get, you know. But to other people, myself included, it feels like, you know, Bergman's saying the cycle continues.
Yes, and onward it goes.
No one's learned anything from this. You know, like the father's sort of forgiven himself because he's gonna, you know, it's really interesting.
Yeah, we're still all fucked, basically.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
that is what's wonderful. That perfect, like you said, we talked about it already, but those kind of, you can interpret it either way. The fact that, like you say, the Vatican might like these films, you know,
exactly.
You know, it's so interesting. Really fine line he manages to walk throughout, doesn't he?
This is it, and I guess this is why, you know, maybe some genre fans are put off by Bergman, because you know, it's for some people, you know, who want to be entertained, who sort of may look at these films and feel like their homework. You know, you maybe you don't quite know what you're saying, and you've got to sort of make up your mind rather than the film just kind of entertaining you for 90 minutes. But you know, I don't think, you know, they're any more difficult than a Lynch movie or a von Trier movie. Like, I think that people shouldn't be intimidated by them. You know, they do confront the darkest corners of the human soul, but a lot of horror does. And, you know, they're engaging, they're dryly funny. You know, you will be entertained and enlightened. Hour of the Wolf is one of the coolest horror films ever made.
We should talk briefly about the Hour of the Wolf, really, because that is obviously, as we've talked about, a lot of his movies are horror movies, but that's the one that's the kind of most overt horror movie, isn't it, in his canon.
The Hour of the Wolf is the hour between night and dawn. It is the hour when most people die, when sleep is deepest, when nightmares are most real. It is the hour when the sleepless are haunted by their deepest fear, when ghosts and demons are most powerful. The hour of the wolf is also the hour when most children are born.
Yeah, it kind of, I feel like it's a sort of a touching stone for von Trier, especially that film. Like, you know, it's almost like Bergman's Antichrist in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't actually think we should say too much about it, because I think
we won't spoil that one.
That should be the entry point, I think, for people listening to this podcast.
Yeah,
you know, who are interested in Bergman but haven't necessarily dive too deeply into his back catalogue.
Yeah,
maybe they've seen The Seventh Seal, maybe they've seen The Virgin Spring, but I imagine that Hour of the Wolf is a sort of lesser seen one.
Yeah, it's a trickier one too.
And it's one that is kind of best experienced as fresh as possible.
Yeah, I agree, and has more of that kind of genre feel, I suppose.
It really does. Yeah.
What is your favourite? Do you have a favourite Bergman movie?
Yeah, so I love Wild Strawberries.
Oh, I haven't seen Wild Strawberries.
Oh my god! Yeah. Okay,
I need to watch it.
It's incredible. It's okay. So not only is it an amazing film, but I actually own the script, and it's just an amazing book because it's got a lovely introduction by Bergman, and they've included the cutting continuity, which scripts don't.
Nice,
obviously, but it's got the complete list of cuts in the back. So,
oh my god!
If there's any kind of burgeoning filmmakers out there who want to sort of analyse it, pick up the script. But I won't say too much about it because I don't want to spoil it for you, but it was released in the same year as The Seventh Seal, which is unreal to me, the fact that these two masterpieces came out in the same year. And they're kind of companion pieces in a way. They both... Wild Strawberries also has horror elements. It's got... I saw Wild Strawberries when I was quite young, and there is a scene early on in a dream sequence that I found really disturbing and kind of stayed with me for a long time. But it's basically... It's about an elderly man who is on a journey of his own, and he kind of encounters people, and he's coming to the end of his life, and I think that's all I'm going to say about it. But it is a masterpiece.
Oh, wonderful! Wonderful!
It's so beautiful.
I think my favourite is probably it's quite an obvious one, but it is Persona. I've always been a bit obsessed by Persona. I think it's incredible.
Yeah, Persona is it's an unbelievable film. So ahead of its time.
Yeah, it is.
Like, you could kind of watch it in a double bill with Fight Club.
Yes, you could. Or Mulholland Drive.
Mulholland Drive.
Yeah.
And I just think that it might not be the best place for people to start.
No, it's not. It's absolutely not. No, it's quite a sort of it's a tricky one to sort of penetrate initially, I think.
But so influential. Like, it feels like not all of them, but so many of the great directors kind of did their persona.
Absolutely.
So Robert Altman's Three Women.
Yeah.
Fassbinder's Fear of Fear. Mm-hmm. Like, it's one of those films that, partly because it was so groundbreaking in its own way, but I think a lot of directors, you talk about like the Sex Pistols being this band that made loads of people start bands.
Yes.
I feel like Persona may have made a lot of filmmakers.
Yes, you're probably right. Well, I remember doing film studies at uni, and it was like Film Studies 101. We watched Persona even before we watched, Citizen Kane or whatever. It was like sit down and watch Persona. Yeah, and it is fascinating, and it is, and again, weirdly, just from a horror context, there is something I find really chilling about it, especially these weird montagey moments. There's one at the beginning and there's one midway through which terrify me.
They are full-blown horror montages.
Yeah.
Like, there's guts in there. There's a big spider, and
yes,
you know.
there's a like a crucifix, like a kind of nail going through a palm of a hand, and, you know, being hammered. Yeah, it's very odd. And again, it's this kind of weird feeling of you don't quite feel comfortable in what you're watching or trust what you're watching with that film as well, which I love that kind of feeling.
Completely. And another one that's kind of quite horror-y, Winter Light.
Oh, yeah, I've not seen that either.
Yeah, so that kind of feels like a Haneke film.
Yes.
But it also feels like, you know, that would actually make quite a good double bill with Frankenstein's creature, because it feels like his take on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, you'll watch it to see why, but that's another good one for horror lovers.
Yeah, it's interesting, the Haneke connection. There is a Haneke connection, I think, as well, isn't there? I mean, I think White Ribbon really feels like a Bergman film to me.
100%.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's another one that is really like, Winter Light. So,
interesting, yeah.
Oh, God, yeah.
All right, wonderful. Well, before we finish as well, I've got to ask you, what's your favourite folk horror?
Right, this is quite a tricky one. Partly
because no one really knows what folk horror is. And
yeah. I mean, so I've got one that, like, you know, may kind of stretch the definition.
That's all right. We love that. That's fine.
So, have you seen Who Can Kill a Child?
Yes.
Right.
On the island.
Yeah. So you've got, you know, so just for anyone out there who hasn't seen it, it's about a couple from the city who go to an island, kind of rural-ish location, where all the kids have killed the adults. And the kids' kind of murder impulse comes from this kind of weird supernatural connection they have that can be passed on by them kind of looking at each other. And it's kind of insinuated that it's a survival instinct, that adults hurt children, so the children are killing the adults before that can happen. Yeah. And I don't know, it feels a little bit... No, you're
totally right. It does. Yeah, so much so that I'm actually now regretting not including it. But yeah, it's like it's got that whole, and actually not a whole lot different to something like Children of the Corn in a way, which is completely folk horror in a lot of ways.
Definitely more folk horror, But
you're right, there are connections
there's something in there, but in terms of what you've covered, Night of the Hunter is
it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one of my all-time favourite films. Yeah. Like it's top 5.
Yes, exactly the same.
It's to the extent that every now and then I think to myself, do you know what? Maybe I won't make another film. Maybe I'll just make
Charles Lawton.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe I'll have it be, you know, Frankenstein's creature can be Night of the Hunter. It can be Carnival of Souls.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I love it so much. I love Charles Lawton, and I know James loves him as well. So
it is just what a perfect film that is. What a weird film that is. I love it so much.
It's incredible. Yeah. It's a perfect, and it's again unbelievable to me that it wasn't appreciated.
It's baffling
release. Like, it was just, there's so many stunning images in that film, and there's so much intensity. The atmosphere is unbelievable. The performances are unreal, and you know how anyone can sit and watch that film and come away from it disappointed.
I don't get it either.
Baffling.
I don't get it, and I've met a lot of people that don't love it, and I don't get it. I'm like, why? You've watched it wrong or something. It's so weird. But I agree, it's so beautiful. You could like frame any frame, in that movie,
completely.
Couldn't you? It's wonderful. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me once
again.
Thank you.
Sam. I've loved it.
It's been such a pleasure. Where can people find you? Obviously, you do the Arrow Video podcast, social media, that kind of thing.
That's it. Yeah. So Arrow Video podcast with Sam and Dan. Just search that on iTunes, and if you haven't listened to it, I think there's a lot that listeners to this podcast will enjoy there.
Absolutely, a lot of connections.
And I'm on Twitter at Sam Ashurst, SAMASHURST. Almost forgot how to spell my own name there. I mean, it's very hot today.
We should make that clear. It's very hot. I think we've done well.
Yeah, and then I'm on Instagram at Sam Ashurst23, and occasionally I kind of put up bits and pieces around Frankenstein's creature on there, and also some embarrassing pictures of myself. So,
love it.
What's not to like? But yeah,
amazing.
That's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening, and a huge thank you to my guest, Sam Ashurst. Great to have him back on the podcast. Don't forget, if you want to find any details of Sam and Sam's new movie, Frankenstein's Creature, check him out on social media. All of the details will be listed in the show notes. So what did you think of this week's show? What do you think of Ingmar Bergman and his movies, The Virgin Spring and The Seventh Seal? Get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter @evolutionpod or on Facebook. That's facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. Don't forget, there is also a discussion group for the podcast for listeners to be able to join, chat to each other about anything and everything. You can talk about this week's episode, you can talk about folk horror, you can talk about the horror genre or anything you like. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. And don't forget, you can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Libsyn, Stitcher, Podbean, and various others. Please do subscribe, hit that subscribe button, and if you haven't done so, just spare a minute to leave a little rating or review. It just helps give the podcast a boost, it helps us get discovered by new listeners, and it's also very nice for me to read. So, on to next week then. What's next? Well, interestingly, we're going to be covering some of the themes that were brought up in this week's show, particularly in The Virgin Spring. We're going to be moving on to two 70s movies, one set in the UK, one set in America, both quite infamous and controversial in their own ways. Both set in rural, isolated areas, both dealing with rape, revenge, and murder. Joining me next week is a newbie to the podcast. It's going to be journalist critic Elena Lazic. She's going to be joining me to discuss Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs from 1971 and John Boorman's Deliverance from 1972. A lot of really interesting stuff to discuss next week as we are slowly migrating from what you might call traditional folk horror and into exploitation and hicksploitation cinema. So join me next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.